Leasehold estates grant fewer rights than freehold estates do. Boiling down the leasehold estates into common language, what we're talking about is the landlord-tenant relationship. The person who holds the leasehold is what we would commonly refer to as the tenant or lessee. The owner of the property who is granting the right to occupy the property, we call them the landlord or the lessor. The relationship is one where the landlord is conveying the right to occupy for a specified period of time. An important technical detail is that the lease itself is actually considered personal property of the tenant. Now there are 4 different leasehold types: estate for years, periodic tenancy, estate at will, and estate at sufferance. We'll go through each in order. An estate for years is a lease for a fixed period of time. The weird part about this type of estate is even though we call it an estate for years, it doesn't have to be delineated in years. The only important part is that it's for a fixed period of time. The tenant, during the period of the lease, is occupying the property legally. This is an important point to make when we look at one of the other types of estates within the leasehold category. So let me give an example of an estate for years. If an owner enters into a rental agreement with a tenant for a length of 9 months, this would be considered an estate for years because it's for a fixed period of time. Next up, periodic tenancy. A periodic tenancy is a lease where there's no termination date that is set. You have a specific lease period, such as 1 day, 1 week, or 1 year, but it doesn't terminate at that point. Instead, it will continue until either party gives notice of termination. The lease will just continue to be renewed at the same increment of time as previously specified. For example, if a property is rented on a month-to-month basis. This is the most common example of what you'll see in the real world. What happens a lot is that a landlord will grant a tenant the right to occupy the property every month, and the lease will just automatically continue until either one of the landlord or the lessee decides to terminate the relationship. They'll both, of course, have to follow the rules for proper notice. The 2 leasehold types that we just talked about, the estate for years and the periodic tenancy, are ways that leases can be formed between a landlord and a tenant. The next 2 categories deal with what happens after the lease ends. An estate at will is usually temporary and allows a tenant to occupy the property for an unspecified period of time. It is done with the permission of the landlord. The tenant can assign this right to occupy the property to anybody else, and it is only between the landlord and the tenant. If either party were to pass away during the time of an estate at will, it would terminate. An example of an estate at will is if a tenant is in a yearly lease agreement with the landlord and the lease is expired. Let's say that the tenant continues to pay at the same rate they were paying during the period of the lease with the permission of the landlord while they're trying to negotiate a new agreement. That would make it an estate at will. The last of our leasehold estates is known as an estate at sufferance. As a real estate professional, this is the one you hope you never encounter. An estate at sufferance, or tenancy at sufferance, happens when at the end of a rental agreement the tenant refuses to leave. If the tenant stays after the legal rental agreement is over, they're known as a holdover tenant, and we've now have a situation of an estate at sufferance. At this point, the landlord would need to pursue legal options for eviction. An example of an estate at sufferance is a tenant who has a lease from January 1st to September 31st, pays the rent every month on time, but then doesn't leave the property after getting proper notice from the landlord to vacate at the end of the lease on September 31st. Beginning November 1st, that would be the first day this property would be an estate at sufferance. You might think that the tenant at this point would be a trespasser, but the key difference here is that the tenant at one point was in a proper legal agreement to occupy the property.